Story-wise, I went through doing Earth, Wind, and Fire. So it was the first huge record I did was Earth, Wind, and Fire, which we recorded at Caribou. But I was again went back to Paris, hung out in Paris, doing some engineering and running a studio, and then was invited back to do Earth, Wind, and Fire by the same managers as Little Feat,
Right.
Cavallo Ruffalo. And I'm still friends with Joe Ruffalo. And we're going to start a label. Talk us out of it. Andrew, talk us out of it.
That's well, if you know how
Yeah,
to make you know how to make 10 million in the music business,
yeah. Start
start
with
with
20 million.
30 and
Yeah, 30 or
and
50,
start a
yeah, or
label.
100. Yeah.
No, I
So
wouldn't.
at any rate, yeah, after you.
No, I wouldn't talk anyone out of starting a label. I just talk people out of spending a lot of money starting a label.
If you don't spend money, there's a great story about how I teach my students how to show that they believe in something, where I ask them if they want to bet and how much do they want to bet. And I regularly lose bets to show them that it's no shame in losing a bet, because in the long run, I'm going to come out ahead. Let's go back to
All right.
my coming to Caribou
Yes.
and getting there 3 days ahead of time, getting used to the weather. Instruments are delivered, and the instruments are all out of tune. So one of the things I did my entire career was to bring a strobe tuner, an early Peterson neon light strobe tuner, and I can tune a piano, but I can really tune a guitar. I know how to tune a B string. So for all of these big bluegrass records, I was the pitch reference for all the instruments. I would Somebody would say, "How's my E string?" And I'd strobe and help them from the control room tune their guitar. So that's come a long way. But I got there ahead of time, and none of these instruments were tuned. The bridges were all fucked up. So I tuned Verdine's two basses. I tuned Johnny Graham's guitar. I tuned Al McKay's guitars. And when they played, they're playing in tune. So, I mean, they were pretty impressed with that and pretty impressed with me until we did the first take. And I'm engineering on COS electrostatic headphones, which I had learned in Europe to carry around with me, because all of these systems, I mean, you've engineered in Europe on tannoys and Lockwood enclosures.
Mm.
I mean, you have no idea what you're hearing. So I used to carry COS headphones. So I bring these to Caribou Ranch, and I'm recording Earth, Wind, and Fire on COS headphones. I have the prettiest little classical presentation. And so the band comes in the control room, and we finish a playback, and Al McKay calls a band meeting, and they go out in the hallway.
That's never good.
And it wasn't good, but Maurice White comes in, and so I know I'm fired, and it's okay. That's all right. I've been fired before, and still get fired. So Maurice comes back in the control room and says, and Larry Dunn will verify this story. He says, "Looky here, play that back again, but turn it up." And so Caribou control room was set up with quad speakers front and back. So I floored it, front and back, 11, and band comes back in and they're dancing. And I'm doing a mix while we go. So that was while I'm watching them responding to it. So I kept the gig, but they had fired me. Went out in the hallway and said, "Man, this guy's got to go. He's got to go." And that track was Shining Star, and it turned into a relatively big record.
Yeah, it was relatively big. Well, okay, let's talk about that just in particular, because I listened to it again today. And I mean, everybody knows that track, but if you haven't heard it recently, it's worth going back and listening to it. But there's just a tiny detail thing, but I've got you here, so I'm allowed to ask.
Okay,
So in
there's
the
bodies
intro,
buried. There's bodies buried in that track.
well, I wasn't going to go anywhere near the bodies. You can tell me about the bodies, because I'd love to hear that. But I just have a really specific engineering question about it. Because in the intro, you've got the two guitars. You got the little picking rhythm guitar on the left, and it's got this great kind of watery sounding slap delay on the right. And then in the verses, it's almost the exact same effect on the voice, is this very stereo, like ping pong delay. It's like an H910 or like, what is it?
Earlier than that, it was a piece of shit. It was called an Orange or something, DDL. And it was horrible. Aliasing and side tones. and just shitty. But it was the only detail we had before we got a Lexicon Delta T. And that was the width of
but
the voice.
Whatever's ringing on it, it almost sounds like a tiny bit of spring reverb back in there. Like, it's incredible. It's such a cool sound.
Live echo chambers, 2 live echo chambers, long and short, at Hollywood Sound.
Right.
And I would go up to the live chamber and tune it by putting in little 12 by 12 blocks of foam, so I could make it really short. I was trying to make it like Motown, to make it really short, to get that kind of tight, diffuse reverb on the voice. But that's how we tune chambers.
Now, is that part of the very secretive Motown sound? Is this incredibly short chamber that they were putting on everything? Because Bruce had a great story about trying to go visit the studios and they wouldn't let him, and he was working for him.
No. And the Bob Olson was there, and Bob Olson, the Nashville mastering engineer, and he could probably talk about what that room was, but nobody, it's like A&R, 799 7th, Studio A. Nobody really knew physically what that room was like. Yeah, Right Track copied some things about it. Same thing with the Motown chamber. We all kind of knew it was a really bright chamber, maybe lath and plaster, but really bright. And but we don't really know what was in there. We don't know if there were speakers in there or whether they opened a trap door and it was in the ceiling. We don't know. So we have to just live with listening to the sound.
Yeah.
And trying to learn what that sound is in our mind's ear, and then we can get somewhere with it.
And copying stuff doesn't work anyway.
No, it doesn't, because it's a whole different music, different time.
Even, I mean, there was a Studio 3 at Hit Factory in New York was like a to the millimeter copy of, was it Sunset 3? Which room was it that they copied?
Either Hyder 3 or Sunset 3. They blend together. I think it must have been Hyder 3.
Yeah.
And Hyder 3 was that hit room.
And it sounded nothing like it. You know, same materials, same dimensions, same absolutely everything. Or
it was United Western 3. United Western 3 was where a lot of the Beach Boys things were done.
Right.
And I think
you're
Hyder's
right. You're right. That
but,
is what the room was. Yeah. Yeah. And of course it didn't sound anything like it. So
never sounds the same.
We've learned our lesson. We've learned our lesson with that. All right. Well, let's keep talking about Earth, Wind and Fire for a second, because you didn't just make a few records with them. You were doing live mixing and touring. Like you were basically, you went from being fired to being almost part of the band for a bit.
Well, and except for the fact that I was, and I have to say it, and nobody was racist about it. It wasn't spoken, but I was white, and all of those guys were black. And I've had this conversation of how to best address that. And I worked for them for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
I just worked for them. By the way, I didn't get points. Never got points. The early records, I got $25 an hour and worked my ass off. And at some point, when Maurice got the idea of doing Kalimba Productions and all of these different records, we did Ramsey Lewis records, 2 Ramsey Lewis records. Had a hit. Sun Goddess was a hit for Ramsey Lewis. And The Emotions and Denise Williams and on and on. And I had to do all that work, and I burned out. I had to get other guys to help me handle all that work. But until that happened, I did all of the mixing up until Let's Groove Tonight in 81. And then finally, I couldn't take it anymore.
Right.
I couldn't do it.
And so was stepping back from that part of what made you decide to start up GML, like just actually take a bit of a left turn, or this was all just going on simultaneously anyway?
One of the deals I made with Cavallo and Ruffalo was that I would step, and Maurice had stopped paying me. He just cut me off. He didn't like that I.
And this is Rob Cavallo's dad we're talking about.
This
right?
is Rob Cavallo's dad.
Yeah.
I'm not going to tell any Rob Cavallo stories. No. It's okay. It's okay, Rob. I like Rob. After I stepped back, Maurice stopped paying me. So at some point, this couldn't continue. So I made a deal with Bob where I took everything that I had designed, including the automation system. The basic GML automation system was designed for the complex, that I would get all rights to that and rent space. So I had a room there engineering room and kept working at the complex and kept recording at the complex. But I was no longer on the staff at the complex. And Maurice continued. He worked with Mick Kozowski and Paul, and I can't remember Paul's last name. And he got to do everything he ever wanted to do. I was there with Maurice when we were mixing to give him an alternate view of what these sounds could be. And part of him just hated it, just hated it. He never thought he was getting what he wanted.
Right.